Hi there, welcome to this lecture looking at the right realist solutions to crime. I've already done another lecture on the right realist causes of crime, so it might be worth looking at that one previously if you haven't already. So the right realist solutions to crime, there are several. I'm going to focus on three of the main ones at the moment. You've got three images there, and they're both sort of representing the ones I'm going to look at. We've got broken windows theory. We have zero tolerance policing. And the final image at the bottom is looking at what's known as situational crime prevention, which is generally when you try and either design an area so that crime is less likely to be chosen by an offender, or you might use things like target hardening to, again, reduce the chances of an offender making a decision to commit a crime. So each of these solutions are based on the right realist causes. Okay, and like I said in the previous lecture, right realism believe that biological differences can lead to criminality. So certain genetic traits, certain personality traits, and inadequate socialization. That's very much using the ideas of Charles Murray and his critical writing on the underclass. He said that young people, particularly being socialised into lone parent families, for example, are far more likely to turn to criminality or end up acting and behaving in a deviant way because they haven't been socialised into the correct norms and values. However, these are really challenging areas to develop social policy or criminal policy to resolve, like interfering with socialisation. How can you come up with a policy to correct socialisation, for example? However, the other cause of crime, according to right realists, one of their main areas of focus is the idea that crime is a rational choice. And a rational choice is when an offender will look at a situation and weigh up the pros and cons of committing that crime. Okay, and as a result, right realists believe that that element of decision making, the rational choice theory, if you like, that's where we can develop practical solutions to make crime less attractive to a rational actor. So they focus on the idea of control, containment, and punishment rather than eliminating the causes of crime itself. So whether they be social causes, economic causes, or what have you. And again, they don't focus on the rehabilitation of offenders. That's a key difference between right realism and left realism, because left realism does want to deal with the causes, such as relative deprivation, and left realism is a big fan of rehabilitation through the criminal justice system to prevent reoffending. Whereas right realists are very much about, no, we need to control criminality, we need to contain it, remove it, and we need to punish harshly. So their policies very much focus on reducing the rewards of crime, increasing the costs of crime in terms of like the severe punishments to the offenders. And this generally does translate, like I said, into prison sentences, and also making sure that punishments happen really quickly after offending. So to a rational actor, they will see the immediate consequences of that criminality. And it does link somewhat back to that Durkheim theory of boundary maintenance. By seeing others punished quickly and harshly, it will put other offenders off doing it or remind them what's acceptable behaviour. And like I mentioned, we're going to talk through broken windows theory, zero tolerance policing, and situational crime prevention, including the idea of target hardening today. So broken windows theory was developed by Wilson and Kelling. Okay, Wilson and Kelling. And they argued that it is essential to maintain the orderly character of neighbourhoods. Okay, keep neighbourhoods looking nice. Any sign of deterioration, whether that be graffiti, vandalism, such as broken windows, or a lot of litter, for example, they need to be dealt with straight away. Now, their idea behind that is that if an area shows that there's a lack of care, then that suggests that, there isn't really any informal social control in that area. If there is graffiti, if there's broken windows, that suggests that it's kind of okay to behave deviantly in this area. There are deviant norms are tolerated, which suggests that, like I said, the people in the area don't really care. So the lack of informal social control. And if those issues aren't being challenged and dealt with, it also suggests that there's no or very limited formal social control. So the police aren't really in that neighbourhood preventing people acting in that way. So that actually can lead to other crimes, according to right realists. And I'd just like you to have a think about why that might be. So if you are a potential criminal and you are in a neighbourhood with, lots of broken windows, litter, really, really dilapidated, it might give you the impression that people don't really care about this area. This is a good area, perhaps, to set up your criminal business, your criminal operation. It might be a good area to maybe mug someone because people don't seem to be looking out for one another in this area. It might be a good area to perhaps do some drug dealing. So you start to see an escalation of criminality from what we'd consider very low-level deviance, like broken windows and graffiti. You start to see an escalation of deviance, okay, because of that. The rational actor is looking at the situation and going, "Oh, it looks like I can get away with my crime in this area." So they argue that the police really should focus on patrolling the streets. Okay, so they want to see police on the streets. They want them to be visible so that citizens, if you like, potential victims, they feel safer. Okay, and it will also be a deterrent to potential criminals in that area. And again, this is another similarity with left realism. Okay, left realism also argued that, yep, we need to have police on the streets. We need them kind of in the community so that people feel safe. However, their approaches to policing differ in terms of what those police should be doing in those communities. Now, the best example of broken windows being applied really is in New York. It was applied across the entire city in 1994 by Giuliani, who was mayor at the time. However, prior to that, if you like, the test case for that was on the New York subway. In something known as Operation Enforcement. The New York subway in the 1970s and 80s was infamous for criminality. They were very run-down subway carts. They had lights not working. The graffiti was epic on the outside and inside of these carriages. And they were pretty scary things to travel on, and criminality was very high. People got mugged. There were sexual attacks. There was violence. It was controlled by different gang networks. So Operation Enforcement developed from the broken windows theory written by Wilson and Kelling, where Kelling particularly consulted on this, and they started to clean up the different subway carts. They removed all the graffiti. They fixed all the windows. They made sure the lights worked. They made sure that there were regular patrols on the subway carts. And all that did was suggest that people cared and people were looking out for one another on those subways. And we saw crime drop significantly. And then in 94, that was then rolled out as a city-wide campaign, particularly targeting neighbourhoods that were deprived and run down in New York. So we're going to have a quick look at Zimbardo's study and think about how this actually supports the right realist approach, particularly broken windows. So some of you might have come across this before. So he tested broken windows theory in 1969. He took two different cars without license plates, and he parked them with their hoods up, one in a street in the Bronx, which at the time was very much the ghetto closest to New York, high levels of deprivation. And he parked a similar car in a similar situation with the hood up on the street in Palo Alto, California, which is a pretty nice middle-class neighborhood and respectable. What he found through observing this car at a distance was that in the Bronx, it was attacked by vandals within 10 minutes of its apparent abandonment. They removed different items from the engine that had any value, and then after the sort of valuables had been stripped from the car, the random destruction began, if you like. Okay, the vandalism for fun and thrill, for example. And he did argue that most of the adult vandals were well dressed and apparently clean cut whites. Okay, so this wasn't a crime that he noticed a racial aspect to, and that was in the rundown area. Whereas this compares with the car in Palo Alto, which was parked in a relatively nice, well-kept area. it sat untouched for more than a week, despite the fact that the hood was up. And it was only when Zimbardo then smashed part of the car with a sledgehammer that passers-by started to join in with the vandalism. So within a few hours of a window, or it must have been a window being broken, the car was completely and utterly trashed. Now, again, the vandals seem to be primarily respectable whites, in inverted commas, whatever that might mean. But what he argued was, firstly, the fact that the unattended property does become fair game, but only, if you like, when that damage happened. Okay, that damage to the car, the smashed window, suggests, actually, hang on, crime or deviance is tolerated in this particular area, even in the respectable neighbourhood. So the summary at the very end, he argued that the nature of community life in the Bronx, in the sense that there wasn't much community life, it was very an anonymous neighbourhood, it was individualistic, people didn't feel safe, people didn't patrol the streets in terms of like neighbourhood watch and what have you. And the frequency with which, vandalism happened, cars were abandoned, stuff was stolen or broken, led to the idea that no one cares. And as a result of that sense of no one caring, that lack of informal control, vandalism began much more quickly, compared to Palo Alto, where actually clearly people had a belief that private possessions are cared for and that mischievous behaviour is costly. Because in Palo Alto, they didn't damage the car or vandalise it for a whole week, despite the fact that it had its hood up, which would have made it easy to steal things from the engine. However, the vandalism can occur anyway once the communal barriers, the sense of kind of, if you like, the informal control, once that sense of mutual regard and obligation and civility are lowered by any action that indicates the fact that no one cares. So it was the breaking of the window that suggested, oh, no one cares about this item, other people can start vandalising it. Okay, so he really is quite a powerful, if you like, field experiment to demonstrate that broken windows does really affect whether people will rationally choose to act deviantly. Because even in a middle class neighbourhood, once the window was broken in that car, people started acting and behaving deviantly around it. But the key takeaway is that prior to that window being broken, the car in the middle class nice neighbourhood was not damaged, because there was a strong sense of, oh, people care about stuff in this neighbourhood, unlike the Bronx. So the second approach I want to talk to you about is zero tolerance policing, and broken windows and zero tolerance policing generally go hand in hand. It is not possible to address all causes of crime through broken windows. So as a result, we need something else to stop people committing crime and make crime unattractive. And again, we're going to go back to that rational choice balance of options, like balancing the risks versus the rewards. So if you can really reduce the rewards of crime and increase the consequences of crime, and also increase the likelihood of getting caught, you're going to make it much more likely that a rational offender is going to look at the equation and go, nope, it's not worth it monetarily. I've got a really severe punishment coming my way. And oh gosh, look at that. It looks like I'm quite likely to get caught as well. You're going to really reduce criminality if you can get those three aspects in place. And this was all kind of wrapped up in zero tolerance policing, which again in New York in 1994, that was also introduced as part of the approach to reducing crime in New York. Like I said, broken windows was, if you like, the theoretical basis that led to zero tolerance policing. If you can control street crime and you're very tough on smaller offences such as graffiti and loitering, also homelessness as well, this will put off more serious offenders. So this is the basis of zero tolerance policing. And one of the best examples again of this was again in New York, where they used 3 strikes and you're out. So if you committed 3 offences, you went to jail, you went straight to prison, and normally for quite a long time. Now, that might not sound too bad because you think, well, hang on, if someone's committed 3 crimes, maybe they should go to jail. But the issue is that it was any level of offence. So, for example, if you graffitied once, you loitered on the street in an area that you've been asked to move on from once, even if, I don't know, you had been playing a ball game in an area where you weren't allowed to, those three offences would have led to time in jail in New York. And this is about enforcing harsh and quick punishments to deter offending. And it makes crime really unappealing. And there was one case of a burglar. He got 16 years in jail, which is an enormous period of time, because he had burgled 3 times. I can't remember what the first one was exactly, but they were very minor minor robberies, because he didn't steal high value things. And his last one, he did break into a house, and all he stole was the contents of a purse and an iPhone. But he got 16 years in jail. So that is a really harsh punishment. But that is a massive deterrent as well. So I'm just going to go back to that one, just to talk to you a little bit. Oh. Anyway. And actually, I'll talk to you about the evaluation. Sorry, I've got it on this slide. Sorry. So I just want to quickly evaluate with you broken windows theory and zero tolerance policing. Firstly, broken windows. Cleaning up a neighbourhood doesn't really deal with structural causes of crime like poverty. And this is where you can start linking in your Marxism, because Marxism would always say, look, the reason people commit crime is because they are poor, they are in a capitalist society where they're told that they need money to live well, and they literally can't afford the lifestyles. So Marxism very much does blame criminality on the huge inequality created in the capitalist system. And don't forget, left realists also say relative deprivation particularly really drives criminality. Okay, the sense that, oh, look at what the others have, I want that, and that's driven by the media, according to the left realists. And the other big problem with broken windows is that nicer neighbourhoods generally leads to increased property costs, so the actual value of property goes up, and rent costs particularly. Now, most people on low incomes, they don't own their properties, they rent their properties, and quite often rents go up much quicker. Now, because if you clear up a neighbourhood, more people want to live there, that means that the property prices generally go up. And this sort of pushes those deprived groups out. So that pushes your working class out of the neighbourhoods. And this is what's known as gentrification. You start to see a lot more middle class people move in, a lot more white middle class people particularly move in, and that really does push the poorer communities out into other rundown areas. And the big problem with that really is that it hasn't stopped crime. It hasn't protected those deprived groups from crime. It's just displaced the crime to another area, moved it to another area. So that's a problem, because it's not actually stopping crime, it's just moving it. And then there's the other ethical issue, if you like, of just completely uprooting communities where they've been established for a number of years. They've now had to move out of an area where they might have lived their entire lives. So that's not very fair ethically. Examples of where that happened, for example, a bit closer to home with us, is where's known as Canary Wharf in London. Some of you might have studied it in geography possibly, but Canary Wharf is now one of the business districts in London, in East London. However, that used to be a very working class neighbourhood. That was the docks, if you like. And they had lots and lots of small, cramped housing, lots of dark roads, and you know what, a level of criminality as well. But if you've ever been to Canary Wharf, or if you Google it, it is, it's full of sky rises and glass buildings and flash bars and what have you now. So those poorer communities were just pushed out of that neighbourhood, if you like, displaced them, and completely uprooted communities that have been established there for almost hundreds of years. Now, zero tolerance policing, there is lots, probably more to criticise about it. And again, most of this does come from left realism, which is useful if you're going to evaluate. It does lead to a very strong sense of them versus us. The way the police target communities and individuals has a really ethnic and racial profile. They are far more likely to stop and challenge the behaviour of young people. And again, far more likely, particularly in the UK, it's far more likely to stop black people. And in America, it's both the black and Hispanic community that seem to get stopped. and searched and their behaviour challenged much more often. Particularly for criminality that's on the streets or just behaviour that's on the streets, not even what I define as criminal behaviour. Working class communities haven't necessarily got the resources to pay for, going to restaurants, going to the cinema, and doing quite nice leisure activities indoors. Quite often, particularly young working class people will socialise on the streets, and that's kind of defined as loitering and can be seen as antisocial. So again, you're getting those sorts of behaviours that, ultimately aren't really criminal, and yet they are criminalised because of unfair law creation and enforcement. And that really does kind of undermine the relationship between the police and these communities, which can, again, lead to more criminality because people don't like the police, they don't respect the police, they also don't report crime to the police because they don't see the police as there to protect them. Another one of the issues of zero tolerance policing is mass incarceration. Yes, New York had a huge drop in criminality, and in terms of the function of the criminal justice system, arguably it's because it took all of the criminal people, or many of the criminal people, out of society and put them all in jail, and that kept the rest of society safe. However, mass incarceration is really harmful to the individuals in jail. There are very limited rehabilitation programs in jail. And once you're in jail, particularly if it's low-level offences like, graffiti, loitering, maybe some sort of level of vagrancy, like not having a home, for example, there is that process of being re-socialised into a much more extreme criminal lifestyle. And we also know about the barriers to criminals once they leave jail. Actually finding a job is really difficult with a criminal record. And that can feed into the really high reoffending rates. One, because you've been socialised into criminal norms and values in jail. And secondly, you're not able to access, material resources in a legitimate way. You're not able to get the job. So you do end up committing a crime in order to support yourself and possibly your family. There were other criticisms of zero tolerance policing was that there were other explanations for the drop in crime. So, for example, we know in the 1970s and 80s, the use of crack cocaine was increasing. Crack cocaine is a drug that leads to people behaving in a very aggressive manner. And it's hugely addictive, which led to lots of criminality associated with trying to feed that habit. That started to drop significantly, okay? And people sort of turned to other types of drugs that were less, if you like, aggressive. There was also the availability of legal abortions at the end of the 1970s. This was, if you like, when you look at society from a macro perspective, at the end of the 1970s, women were able to get legal abortions, particularly around the area of New York. What this meant was that there were less unwanted pregnancies, and if you like, there was a shrink in what Charles Murray called the underclass, particularly. What that meant was that there was less young people growing up in families where A, the pregnancy was unwanted in the first place, and B, those families are already impoverished. Okay, so they're growing up in poverty. Now, that meant that, families became slightly smaller within, if you like, deprived groups, but it also meant those groups could support the members of that family much more. So they were growing up much more economically stable. Okay, so that's an interesting one, that the fact that legal abortion being available in America actually led to a drop in crime, if you like, probably about 15 to 20 years later. Okay, because obviously that's how long it would take for a young baby to grow up to someone who might possibly behave criminally. There was also an economic boom in the 90s, okay? And again, if you're a Marxist, you would look at that and go, hang on, look, the economy started to do really well in the 90s. That meant that more people were lifted out of poverty. That's why crime dropped, okay? Not because of zero tolerance policing and broken windows. And other cities in America that didn't adopt zero tolerance, okay, and focus very much more on, if you like, perhaps more community solutions to policing, they actually saw similar drops at the same time. And the final criticism really is that broken windows and zero tolerance policing do not deal with corporate or white collar crime in any way. Okay, there's nothing going on here that's going to stop a rational white collar worker go, oh, look, I need to stop committing my crime in my corporate environment, because obviously the police aren't patrolling the offices, okay, and the offices are already quite nice buildings to work in, they haven't got broken windows, and yet crime is still happening. It does just focus on street crime. So the final approach that I want to talk to you a bit about today is situational crime prevention. And this sits sort of within the bracket of environmental crime prevention as well. So I've sort of lumped a few approaches together, generally because they focus very much on how do you design out crime from an environment. So it's based on rational choice theory, in that how can you alter a situation to make it less likely that a criminal will rationally choose to commit a crime. And there are several ways to do this according to situational crime prevention. Increase the effort of the crime. So, for example, putting, spikes along walls, so it makes it really difficult to break into a building or a site, for example. Increase the risks, okay, and that can be the risks of getting caught or the risks of harm, okay, that might take place, the risk to the offenders as well. Reduce the rewards, so that can be things like making it much more difficult to sell stolen goods on the marketplace. So for example, I know eBay, for example, has had plenty of reform to prevent, if you like, the selling on of stolen mobile phones, stolen electrical goods, for example. They sort of monitor sites that have high volumes of these types of products, and then they investigate and perhaps remove the listings as well. Oh, and this, sorry, let me go back to the presentation. And reduce provocations, okay? So what that means is when you look at crime, you look at what are the situations where people are provoked into criminality. And that can be, well, if you look at football games, for example, around the bars, okay, around the drinking areas, around the outside of the football pitch, for example, you might prevent pubs putting on special offers when there's a football game on, because you don't want everyone getting really, really drunk. You might have a lot more security and police around the drinking venues, because that's where crime is more likely to happen, because when people get drunk, they're more likely to act in a bit more of a violent way. And I don't know if any of you have been to a football game. Now when they filter out the crowd, and if they have to get to a tube station, for example, in London, they almost give two completely separate routes to the different groups of fans in order to get to the tube stations, so that there's less likely going to be conflict in the street, for example, or on the public transport. For example, I know in Wales, for example, Swansea and Cardiff football, they literally bus the fans out of the city straight from the venue. Okay, so if Cardiff play Swansea in Swansea, the Cardiff fans will come out of the arena and they'll get straight in a bus and be bussed straight out of the city to prevent crime happening. So those are all examples of how do you reduce provocations for crime. And finally, you remove excuses. So you make it really clear to the public what the rules are. You put them up on signs. You make it really clear about what is allowed and what is not allowed. Okay, so people can't say, oh, I didn't realise I wasn't allowed to do this. Okay, I didn't realise I had to have a ticket. I didn't realise I'm not supposed to be here. Now, if you follow that link, which I accidentally just clicked on, you can also scan that QR code. That will take you to a table that goes through lots of different techniques linked to those 5 different headings. And what I'd suggest doing is having a look and just make some notes on the key strategies you could adopt. Don't write everything down, just write the ones you will remember. Okay, so maybe try and write down, 5 or 6 different strategies. Okay, and that you could use to make it much more likely that an offender will choose not to commit a crime. And one last thing I'd like you to think about is what situational crime prevention strategies are used in and around your school or college or university or what have you. Okay, anything that you recognise from that table, if you follow that link, that's you being used. And then hopefully you'll start to recognise that whoever's put those things in place have done it specifically to reduce the chance of crime and or deviance happening. So as part of situational crime prevention, most people who are going to try and design out crime will start off with this triangle, okay, which is linked to what's known as the routine activity theory triangle. Now, this argues that in order for a crime to take place, one of these 3 things needs to be a bit out of balance. And then the other side of that is in order to prevent crime taking place, you need to make sure that all of these three things, okay, are enforced. All right. So first one, for example, is having a motivated offender, an offender who wants to commit crime or needs to commit crime, someone who's really motivated to commit crime for whatever reason. Now, you then need really harsh punishments in place in order to put them off. You need to reduce the rewards of the criminal activity, and you need to reduce the provocation. Okay, take away that motivation. Okay, you need to take away the environment that's going to make someone more likely to choose to offend. So that's how you deal with that part of the triangle. Crime is also more likely to take place if there is an absence of a capable guardian. So a capable guardian is someone or something that is going to stop the offender offending. It could be a parent, okay? It could be a neighbour. It could be a police officer in the area or a security guard. It could be CCTV, okay? So what you want to make sure is in place is a capable guardian, something that is an offender is going to look at and go, oh, no, shouldn't commit crime in this area. I'm going to get into trouble. And that is all about increasing the risk of getting caught, seen, and traced. So again, checking license plates, for example, that's another way of, that's another form of capable guardianship. Often or even a street light can be a capable guardian, okay, because that increases the chance of being seen, for example, and that can put off an offender. Like a street light could even be a capable guardian. And finally, it's about the target, whether that is an individual, a human, okay, are they susceptible to crime, or an item that someone might want to take, for example. So how do you kind of like reduce them appearing as a target? You need to do something called target hardening. So again, you might make sure that mobile phones are kept in zipped pockets. Okay, you might make sure that if you travel late at night, you always travel in pairs, for example. You might make sure that you've got a flashy locking system on your house, like an alarm system, and it's got a big flashing light saying this place is alarmed. You might put a sign up saying got a really aggressive guard dog. Okay, that would all stop an offender thinking, oh, this is going to be an easy target. So what I'd like you to do just briefly is thinking about the strategies that you noted down from the previous slide for situational crime prevention. Where would they fit in with this triangle? Okay, are they dealing with guardianship? Are they preventing an offender, or are they kind of target hardening? See if you can fit them into this triangle. And have a go yourself. Like, these are 3 images that I've just randomly Googled. How would you design out crime from these areas using situational crime prevention? And you know what? You could also use a bit of broken windows theory here as well, I think. Okay, so how would you design crime out from these areas if you were responsible for town planning, or if you were responsible for reducing criminality in these areas? What ideas could you use to make it less likely that crime or deviance would take place? Okay, so I just want to finish off with the evaluation of situational crime prevention. And this is what's known as displacement theory. And we've already mentioned this briefly before with the issue with broken windows. So critics have pointed out, by making crime much more difficult in one place, you simply displace it to another in several ways. And I always use the example of King's Cross for this one. King's Cross is known now as the terminal for the Eurostar, I think it is. However, King's Cross back in the early noughties had lots of different clubs. It had lots of different bars. It was, if you like, quite a dark area. There wasn't very many streetlights, for example, and there was a level of prostitution and drug use in the area as well. Okay, it is now a beautiful open area with lots of little shops. It's got an international train link coming into it. It has been really, really smartened up, and the clubs have been closed down. And with that, The people who use the clubs have had to move to other areas. The drug use associated with the area has shifted to other areas, and also the prostitution that was associated with the area as well has been shifted out. Mainly to areas such as Angel, for example, Camden as well. Saw a lot of that crime and deviance kind of move into its area instead. So again, the crime didn't stop, it just got displaced, got moved to another area. So this is an example of crime being moved physically from one location to another. But there are other ways crime can be displaced. Crime can be moved from one time to another. Okay, so say the police patrol the streets or an area at one particular time of the day. Offenders will just go, right, I won't commit my crime now. I'm going to wait until later on today, or I'm going to do it in the morning, for example. And we've seen that with patterns of car theft, for example. Rather than sort of stealing cars on the street late at night, some offenders have started doing it in the early hours of dawn, for example, because there's less police patrols. Crime can be directed away from one target and onto another. Okay, so instead of perhaps targeting, someone walking down the street to mug them in one particular area, you might say, right, I'm no longer going to target people who look like they might be easier to mug. I'm going to start robbing, stealing bikes, for example. I'm going to start stealing really flashy bikes from cyclists. Okay, so instead of mugging people just walking down the street, you're going to start targeting cyclists because they leave their property unattended. One method of committing a crime can be substitute for another. So whereas you might have been a drug dealer last year, this year you're going to sort of change and maybe become, an identity, get into identity fraud, for example. And one kind of crime can be substituted for another. Going back, one method of committing crime can be substituted for another. In terms of the method, apologies, I meant to say you might have dealt drugs in nightclubs. Now you might start dealing drugs online, okay, using social media, for example. And then when I said one kind of crime substitute for another, instead of being a drug dealer, at that point, you might decide that you are going to get into identity theft, that's substituting one crime for another.